I'm a registered nurse at Blackwater Correctional Facility in Millbrook, Nevada, or at least I was, until I submitted my resignation 3 weeks ago. You can call me Sarah Chen if you want, though most people in the medical unit just called me Nurse Chen during my 18 years there. I've seen everything you can imagine in correctional healthcare: stabbings, overdoses, suicide attempts, psychotic breaks, and every kind of violence and desperation the human spirit can endure behind bars. But what I'm about to tell you about is the one shift that made me question everything I thought I knew about the human mind, and ultimately led me to abandon the profession I once loved entirely. Blackwater Correctional is a maximum security facility serving the southwestern Nevada region. It houses 2,400 of the state's most dangerous offenders, including death row inmates and lifers with nothing left to lose. The medical wing where I worked handles everything from routine medication distribution to emergency trauma care, often with limited resources and constant security concerns. During my time there, I treated hundreds of inmates for every condition imaginable, managed psychiatric crises that would challenge any hospital staff, and dealt with situations where the line between medical care and personal safety becomes terrifyingly thin. The case I'm about to tell you about began long before that horrific night in September. It started on March 8, 2019, when a new inmate was transferred to Blackwater from the psychiatric hospital at Carson Valley. Her name was Elena Vasquez, and she was 42 years old when she arrived. Elena had been serving a life sentence for the murders of 3 women in what prosecutors called ritualistic killings, though the details were sealed due to the disturbing nature of the crimes. She had spent the previous 4 years in psychiatric care after what her defense team described as a complete mental breakdown during her trial. Elena's transfer paperwork indicated she was considered stabilized on a combination of antipsychotic medications, but required ongoing psychiatric monitoring and specialized care. The crime scene photos I wasn't supposed to see, but caught a glimpse of when Detective Morrison was consulting with our psychiatrist Dr. Rachel Winters, showed a level of calculated brutality that still makes my stomach turn. 3 women, all found in their homes, arranged in identical positions with symbols carved into their skin. Elena had been found covered in their blood, catatonic, speaking in what witnesses described as ancient languages that no interpreter could identify. But the Elena Vasquez who arrived at Blackwater seemed nothing like the monster described in those files. She was quiet, polite, and compliant with all medical protocols. During my initial assessment, she answered my questions in a soft, measured voice, made appropriate eye contact, and showed none of the aggressive or erratic behavior I typically saw from inmates with her psychiatric history. Her medical records showed she had been responding well to treatment with risperidone and lithium, and her psychiatrist at Carson Valley had noted significant improvement in her delusions and auditory hallucinations. Elena was assigned to cell block C7, our specialized housing unit for inmates requiring psychiatric care. The block was designed with enhanced monitoring capabilities, reinforced walls, and reduced capacity to allow for more individualized attention. She was placed in cell 47, a single occupancy unit with a small window facing east toward the Nevada desert. The cell was equipped with safety features, rounded corners, tamper-proof fixtures, and an intercom system that allowed constant communication with the medical staff. What struck me most about Elena during those first few months was her intelligence and education. Before her arrest, she had been a professor of comparative religion at the University of Nevada, specializing in ancient belief systems and ritualistic practices. She spoke 4 languages fluently and had published extensively on what she called primitive consciousness studies. During our medical consultations, she would often discuss philosophy, literature, and her research with a clarity and sophistication that seemed completely at odds with her criminal history. Elena told me she remembered very little about the period leading up to her crimes. "It's like there's a gap," she would say, her dark eyes becoming distant. I remember my research, my students, my normal life. Then I remember being in the hospital, confused and medicated, but between those 2 points, there's just darkness. Sometimes I have dreams, but they feel more real than memories. Dr. Winters, our facility psychiatrist, was cautiously optimistic about Elena's progress. She's responding remarkably well to treatment, she told me during one of our case conferences. The medication has stabilized her completely. Her psychological evaluations show no signs of the dissociative episodes or paranoid delusions that characterized her initial breakdown. If I didn't know her history, I would consider her one of our most stable patients. But there were subtle things about Elena that troubled me, though I couldn't articulate exactly what they were at the time. She had an unusual sleep pattern, completely alert and talkative during night shifts, but sluggish and withdrawn during day hours. She requested to have her recreation time moved to late evening, claiming the daylight gave her severe headaches. Most strangely, she seemed to know things about other inmates that she shouldn't have been able to know. I first noticed this about 6 months after her arrival. During one of my evening medication rounds, Elena asked me, "How is Mrs. Patterson doing?" The older woman in C12. "I'm worried about her heart condition." Maria Patterson was indeed in C12, and she did have a serious cardiac condition, but this information wasn't something Elena should have had access to. The cells were soundproofed, and Elena had no interaction with other inmates due to her isolation status. When I asked Elena how she knew about Mrs. Patterson's condition, she looked genuinely confused. "I'm not sure," she said. "I just felt like she was struggling. Maybe I overheard something during shift change, but I knew she couldn't have overheard anything. Her cell was too far from the nursing station, and we were careful about maintaining patient confidentiality, even in our conversations." Similar incidents began occurring with increasing frequency. Elena would ask about inmates she had never met, knowing details about their medical conditions, their family situations, or their legal cases. She would mention that the man in A15 seems sad today, or that someone in B block is planning something dangerous. When I investigated these comments, they were often eerily accurate. The inmate in A15 had just received word that his mother had died. Someone in B block was indeed planning an attack on the guard, something we discovered through intelligence gathering that had nothing to do with Elena's observation. Dr. Winters suggested that Elena might be overhearing conversations between guards or other staff members, or perhaps picking up on subtle environmental cues that suggested certain situations. "Some individuals are remarkably intuitive," she explained. Elena's educational background and high intelligence could make her more adept at reading social and behavioral patterns than the average person. But I began to suspect there was something more unusual happening. Elena would sometimes make comments during our conversations that seemed to reference things that hadn't happened yet. She would mention feeling anxious about the storm coming on days when the weather forecast was clear, only to have severe thunderstorms develop unexpectedly. She would ask if I was feeling better when I hadn't been ill, only to come down with flu symptoms the following day. The most unsettling incident occurred in February 2020, almost a year after Elena's arrival. I was conducting my routine evening medication distribution when Elena looked directly at me and said, "Nurse Chen, you should call your sister tonight. She needs to hear your voice." I hadn't spoken to my sister Jessica in over 2 months. We had a complicated relationship, and our conversations were infrequent and often strained. I had no plans to call her, and Elena certainly had no way of knowing about my family situation. But something about the urgency in her voice compelled me to make that call when I got home that night. Jessica answered on the first ring, and I could immediately tell she had been crying. She had just received a diagnosis of breast cancer that afternoon and had been sitting alone in her apartment, terrified and unsure who to call. If I hadn't reached out that night, she told me later, she might have done something desperate. When I returned to work the next day, Elena smiled at me with what seemed like genuine warmth. "I'm glad you called her," she said. She needed to know she wasn't alone. I never told Elena about my sister's diagnosis. I never told anyone at the facility about that phone call or what I had learned. But Elena somehow knew that her suggestion had been exactly what was needed. Dr. Winters documented these incidents as possible examples of enhanced empathetic perception or intuitive social intelligence. But even she seemed increasingly uncomfortable with Elena's apparent insights. "I've never seen anything quite like this," she admitted to me, after Elena correctly predicted a medical emergency involving an inmate in a completely different block. "Her accuracy rate is statistically impossible if these are just lucky guesses." By the spring of 2020, Elena had been at Blackwater for over a year, and her behavior had become even more puzzling. She maintained her compliance with all medical protocols and showed no signs of the violent tendencies that had led to her original crimes. Her medication levels were stable, her psychological evaluations consistently showed improvement, and she had never been involved in any disciplinary incidents. But her nocturnal alertness was becoming more pronounced. During day shifts, she would sleep deeply, sometimes for 12 or 14 hours straight. But during evening and night hours, she was intensely awake, pacing her cell with an energy that seemed almost electric. The night guards reported that she would often stand at her window for hours, staring out at the desert landscape with an intensity that made them uncomfortable. "She doesn't blink enough," Officer Rodriguez told me one evening. "I've watched her for 20-30 minutes at a time, and she'll just stare out that window without blinking. It's like she's looking at something the rest of us can't see." Elena began requesting books on subjects that seemed unrelated to her previous academic interests. Instead of the religious studies and philosophical texts she had originally asked for, she wanted materials on astronomy, geology, and what she called terrestrial magnetic fields. The prison librarian, Mrs. Hamilton, told me that Elena would spend hours studying star charts and maps of underground water systems in Nevada. "She's particularly interested in anything related to underground caverns or geological formations near the prison," Mrs. Hamilton reported. "She keeps asking for specific topographical surveys of this area, though I can't imagine why an inmate would need that information." The most disturbing change was in Elena's physical appearance. Despite maintaining good health, according to all her medical evaluations, she began to look increasingly gaunt and pale. Her dark hair, which had been thick and healthy when she arrived, became thin and brittle. Her skin took on an almost translucent quality that made her veins clearly visible beneath the surface. But most unsettling were her eyes, which seemed to have developed an unusual reflective quality, especially in low-light conditions. During one of my late-night medication rounds in August 2020, I noticed Elena standing at her cell window in complete darkness. When I turned my flashlight toward her cell, her eyes reflected the light back at me like an animal's. She turned toward me slowly, and I could see that her pupils were completely dilated despite the bright flashlight beam. "The time is getting close, Nurse Chen," she said, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, but somehow carried clearly down the corridor. "They're calling, and soon I won't be able to resist anymore." "Who's calling, Elena?" I asked, though something deep in my gut told me I didn't want to know the answer. "The ones who were here before," she replied, her voice taking on a dreamy, distant quality. "They've been waiting so patiently, but the alignment is almost perfect now. Soon they'll be able to come back." Dr. Winters increased Elena's medication dosage after I reported this conversation, but the changes in her behavior and appearance continued to accelerate. She began refusing most of her meals, surviving on what seemed like impossibly small amounts of food. Her sleep pattern reversed completely. She was now awake all night and unconscious during all daylight hours. as if her circadian rhythm had been completely inverted. The other inmates in C block began complaining about nightmares and sleep disturbances. They reported hearing sounds coming from Elena's cell, not voices or screams, but what they described as a low humming or chanting that seemed to vibrate through the walls. The guards couldn't hear anything during their rounds, but multiple inmates from different cells reported the same phenomenon. Maria Patterson, the elderly woman with heart problems that Elena had somehow known about, requested to be moved to a different block. "That woman is doing something in there," she told me, with tears in her eyes. "I can feel it in my bones. She's calling something, and it's getting closer." By September 2020, Elena had been at Blackwater for 18 months. Despite all the unusual incidents and my growing unease about her behavior, her official psychiatric evaluations continued to show stability. Dr. Winters was even considering recommending Elena for transfer to a lower security facility with better psychiatric resources. "Her progress has been remarkable," Dr. Winters told me during our September case review. "Whatever caused her original breakdown seems to have resolved completely. She's been compliant, non-violent, and shows no signs of the delusional thinking that characterized her initial psychiatric episodes." But I knew something was building toward a crisis. Elena's nighttime behavior was becoming increasingly agitated. She would pace her cell for hours, moving in patterns that seemed almost ritualistic. The guards reported that she had begun arranging her few personal possessions in geometric patterns on her cell floor, creating designs that she would modify slightly each night. On September 15th, 2020, Elena made a request that should have been my final warning. She asked Dr. Winters for permission to spend the night of September 21st, the autumn equinox, in the recreation yard, claiming that she needed to observe the celestial alignment for her research. Dr. Winters initially denied the request, but Elena became more insistent over the following days. She explained that the autumnal equinox represented a crucial data point for her academic work on ancient astronomical practices, and that observing the night sky on that specific date would help her complete research she had begun before her arrest. "It would be therapeutic for me," Elena argued during a psychiatric consultation. "Reconnecting with my academic interests could be an important step in my rehabilitation." Against my strong objections, Dr. Winters ultimately approved Elena's request. "She's been so compliant and stable," she reasoned, "and she'll be under constant guard supervision. It might indeed be beneficial for her psychological recovery to engage with her scholarly interests." The night of September 21st was the beginning of the most terrifying experience of my entire career. As the sun set over the Nevada desert, Elena was escorted to the small recreation yard behind C Block. She had been given permission to remain outside until midnight, with 2 armed guards maintaining constant visual contact. I was scheduled to work the night shift that evening, covering medical duties for all of C Block. Something about Elena's request and the approaching equinox had filled me with a dread I couldn't rationally explain. I had considered calling in sick, but my sense of professional responsibility compelled me to be there in case Elena needed medical attention during her unusual nighttime vigil. As darkness fell over Blackwater Correctional Facility, I began my evening rounds, checking on the other inmates in C Block and preparing for what I hoped would be a routine night. Elena was visible through the reinforced windows of the recreation yard, sitting motionless on a concrete bench and staring up at the star-filled desert sky. But as the hours passed and midnight approached, I began to notice changes in the facility that made my skin crawl. The other inmates in C Block were unusually quiet, not the normal quiet of sleeping prisoners, but an oppressive, almost expectant silence that seemed to press against my eardrums. The fluorescent lights in the corridors began flickering intermittently, and the temperature seemed to drop several degrees despite the warm September weather outside. At 11:47 p.m., 13 minutes before Elena's scheduled return to her cell, Officer Rodriguez's voice crackled over the radio with barely controlled panic. "Medical to recreation yard immediately. Something's wrong with Vasquez. Something's very, very wrong. I grabbed my medical bag and ran toward the recreation yard, not knowing that I was about to witness something that would shatter my understanding of reality and haunt me for the rest of my life. What I found in that yard would change everything I thought I knew about the human mind, about the nature of evil, and about forces that exist beyond our comprehension. The night of September 21st, 2020 was the beginning of the most terrifying 18 hours of my life, and the reason I can never work in healthcare again. I ran toward the recreation yard with my heart pounding, Officer Rodriguez's panicked voice still echoing in my ears. Nothing in my 18 years of correctional healthcare had prepared me for what I was about to witness. When I reached the yard, I found Officers Rodriguez and Martinez standing about 20 feet away from Elena, their hands hovering near their weapons. Elena was no longer sitting on the concrete bench. She was standing in the center of the yard with her arms raised toward the night sky, her head thrown back at an impossible angle that should have broken her neck. But what made my blood run cold wasn't her posture, it was the sound she was making. Elena was speaking, but not in any language I had ever heard. The words flowed from her throat, in a continuous stream of syllables that seemed to bypass her vocal cords entirely, creating harmonics that made the air itself vibrate. The sound was so deep and resonant that I could feel it in my chest cavity, making my ribs ache with each phrase. "How long has she been like this?" I whispered to Rodriguez, not wanting to speak too loudly and risk drawing Elena's attention. "About 10 minutes, he replied, his voice tight with fear. "She was sitting quietly until about midnight. Then she just stood up and started doing this. We tried to approach her, but what?" Martinez answered, his face pale in the moonlight. "The ground around her is warm, Nurse Chen, like hot to the touch. And look at her shadow." I looked down and felt my knees nearly buckle. Elena's shadow in the moonlight wasn't the normal silhouette of a woman with her arms raised. Instead, it showed the outline of something with multiple appendages, something that writhed and shifted independent of Elena's actual movements. The shadow seemed to have a life of its own, reaching toward us with tentacle-like extensions while Elena's physical form remained stationary. "We need to get Dr. Winters down here immediately," I said, though my voice came out as barely a whisper, "and call Warden Harrison. This is beyond our protocols." As if responding to my voice, Elena's head slowly rotated toward us. Her neck turned a full 180 degrees without her body moving, like an owl's movement, but somehow more fluid and unnatural. When her eyes met mine, I saw that her pupils had completely disappeared. Her eyes were now solid white, but they seemed to glow with their own internal light. "Sarah," she said, and her voice was wrong, too deep, with multiple tones speaking in unison. "You came. I knew you would. You've been so kind to me." "Elena," I said, trying to keep my voice steady and professional, "you need to return to your cell now. This behavior is concerning, and I need to examine you." Elena smiled, and I saw that her teeth had somehow become pointed, like a predator's. "This isn't Elena anymore, dear Sarah. She was just the vessel, the doorway. Tonight, the barriers are thin enough for us to cross over." The temperature around us dropped so suddenly that I could see my breath forming clouds in the air. The other inmates in C Block began screaming from their cells, their voices carrying across the yard in a chorus of terror that made my skin crawl. "Us?" I asked, though every instinct told me I didn't want an answer. "We have been waiting so long," Elena's voice continued, but now it sounded like dozens of voices speaking through her throat, sleeping in the spaces between worlds. "But she called to us with her research, and then with her offerings. The 3 women were just the beginning, the ritual to thin the barriers." I realized with growing horror that Elena was talking about her victims, the 3 women she had murdered. This wasn't a psychotic break or medication failure. This was something else entirely, something that challenged every rational explanation I could conceive. Dr. Winters arrived at the yard entrance, took one look at the scene, and immediately began backing away. "This isn't possible," she whispered. "This can't be happening." Elena turned her impossible gaze toward Dr. Winters. "Rachel," she said in that multi-toned voice, Thank you for keeping me stable all these months, for keeping the vessel healthy while we prepared for tonight. What do you want? Dr. Winters asked, her professional composure completely shattered. To come home, Elena replied. This world was ours long before humans crawled from their caves. We built cities in the deep places, raised monuments to sciences your species hasn't even discovered yet, but we were forced to retreat when the barriers between dimensions solidified. Now, finally, we can return. The ground beneath Elena's feet began to crack and split. A sulfurous smell filled the air, like burning metal mixed with decomposing organic matter. Through the cracks, I could see a faint red glow emanating from somewhere far below the prison foundation. The old texts were right, Elena continued, her body beginning to levitate several inches off the ground. This location sits on a convergence point, a thin place where our realm touches yours. Elena discovered this in her research. That's why we called to her, guided her to make the offerings that would weaken the barriers enough for tonight's crossing. Warden Harrison arrived with 6 additional guards, all armed with riot control equipment. But when he saw Elena floating above the cracked earth, speaking in voices that seemed to come from everywhere at once, he stopped dead in his tracks. What in God's name is happening here? He demanded. God has nothing to do with this, Elena's voices responded. This is older than your religions, older than your species. The cracks in the ground widened, and I could hear sounds coming from below, not voices, but something like machinery mixed with organic movement. The red glow intensified, and shapes began moving in the depths beneath the prison. Elena's body began to change before our eyes. Her skin took on a grayish, translucent quality, and dark veins became visible underneath, pulsing with that same red light. Her fingers elongated into claw-like appendages, and her spine curved in ways that shouldn't have been anatomically possible. The crossing begins now, she announced. Thank you all for keeping the vessel safe. Your service will be remembered when we reclaim this world. That's when I made the decision that would haunt me forever. Instead of running, instead of following every survival instinct screaming in my head, I stepped forward. Elena, I called out, using every ounce of authority and compassion I had developed over nearly 2 decades of healthcare. If you're still in there somewhere, you need to fight this. This isn't who you are. The thing that had been Elena paused in its transformation and looked directly at me. For just a moment, I saw a flicker of human consciousness in those glowing white eyes, a trapped, terrified awareness that was screaming silently for help. Sarah, Elena's real voice whispered, barely audible beneath the chorus of other voices. I'm sorry, I tried to resist, but they're so strong. They've been in my mind for years, since before the murders. Please, don't let them. The human voice was cut off, as Elena's body convulsed violently. When the spasms stopped, whatever was looking at me through her eyes was completely alien, completely hostile. The vessel grows weak, the voices announced. But no matter, the crossing is nearly complete. More cracks appeared in the yard's concrete, spreading outward in geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. The red glow intensified, and I could see things beginning to emerge from the depths, shapes that my mind refused to process coherently, forms that seemed to shift between dimensions. Warden Harrison made a decision that probably saved all our lives. Everyone back to the main building, now, he shouted. Call state police, call the National Guard, call whoever you need to call, but we're sealing this entire section immediately. As we ran toward the building, I heard Elena's voices calling after us. You cannot contain what has already begun. We know this place now. We know all of you. This is just the first convergence point. There will be others. The prison went into immediate lockdown. The entire C block was evacuated and sealed. Elena, and whatever was happening in that recreation yard were contained behind reinforced steel doors and concrete barriers. But we could all hear the sounds coming from that section, sounds like reality itself was being torn apart and reassembled. Emergency response teams arrived within hours, but they were as baffled as we were. The radiation detectors, electromagnetic sensors, and every other piece of scientific equipment they brought registered readings that defied explanation. The temperature in the sealed section fluctuated wildly, and seismic equipment detected vibrations that seemed to come from impossibly deep underground. For 3 days, we kept Elena's section under quarantine while experts tried to understand what was happening. The sounds continued, sometimes Elena's voice, sometimes the chorus of other voices, sometimes noises that couldn't have come from any human throat. On the fourth day, everything stopped. When a hazmat team finally breached the recreation yard, they found Elena's body lying on the cracked concrete. She appeared to be dead, but her body showed no signs of decomposition despite the September heat. The cracks in the ground had sealed themselves, leaving only faint scars in the concrete. The red glow was gone, and the sulfurous smell had dissipated. But Elena's body was wrong in ways that couldn't be explained by any medical knowledge I possessed. Her bone structure had somehow altered, her internal organs had shifted position, and her DNA, when they finally tested it, showed sequences that didn't match any known human genetic patterns. The official report classified Elena's death as resulting from an acute psychotic episode complicated by unknown physiological factors. The incident was sealed under national security provisions, and everyone present that night was required to sign non-disclosure agreements. But I knew what I had witnessed couldn't be contained by bureaucratic paperwork or rational explanations. I submitted my resignation the following week. I couldn't continue working in correctional healthcare after seeing something that shattered my understanding of reality itself. More than that, I was terrified. Elena's final words haunted me. "We know all of you." I moved across the country, changed my name, and took a job in retail management. I avoid hospitals, prisons, and anywhere that might put me in contact with people who might be vessels, because I now know that there are things beyond our dimension that can inhabit human bodies, things that have been waiting for the right conditions to cross over into our world. The nightmares haven't stopped. I dream about Elena's transformation, about the sounds coming from beneath the prison, about red glowing cracks appearing in the ground wherever I go. But what terrifies me most are the news reports I see sometimes. Stories about people suddenly developing impossible knowledge, predicting future events, or displaying abilities that can't be explained by medical science. Each time I see one of these stories, I wonder if Elena's crossing was just the beginning. I wonder how many other convergence points exist, how many other vessels are being prepared, and whether what I witnessed at Blackwater was humanity's first glimpse of an invasion that's still in progress. The case of Elena Vasquez remains classified, buried in government files that will probably never see the light of day. But for those of us who were there that night, it serves as a terrifying reminder that our reality is far more fragile than we want to believe. Some doors once opened can never be completely closed again. And sometimes, in the quiet moments before dawn, I still hear those voices calling from somewhere just beyond the edge of our world, patient and persistent, waiting for their next opportunity to come home.